Happy Saturday. Good morning. Good afternoon. Uh, this week in the Congo, we're gonna have a lot to dissect, to break down. But this week in the Congo, uh, the drone strike. We'll be talking about the drone strike that killed Willy Ngoma, who is the M23 military spokesperson near a coltan mine called Rubaya in the Congo, in Eastern Congo. We also have the United States of America sanctioned Rwanda's military. Not one official, not one general, but the entire Rwandan Defense Force. And then we found out that the man M23 installed as a vice governor of North Kivu a year ago, the man they put forward as a civilian force of their administration is a Canadian citizen. He actually claimed refugee status by providing documents that show citizenship from Rwanda. Canada took him in. He built a life there, married, had children, and then came back in the Congo in Africa, not to rebuild the Congo, but to serve as the political cover for foreign backed occupation. Interestingly enough, and while all of that was happening in Central Africa, in the heart of Africa, on the other side of the world, the United States and Israel launched a full scale war on Iran. Bombs on Tehran, regime change, Operation Epic Fury. We are on day seven as of today, I believe, and with over 1,300 people killed, including the supreme leader himself, including children in a girls' school. 165. That's the latest number that is available. The same week, we're still sitting with the weight of what happened, even the week before, because I haven't seen you guys in 2 weeks. 1.2 billion health deal signed between the United States and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Health funding tied to conditions, conditions tied to data, and data tied to pathogens, and a full MOU text that the Congolese people still has not seen. So Zimbabwe, who is in the same case as the Congo, walked away from its own deal, and the US immediately moved to cut 1.2 million HIV patients off from that treatment. The Kenyan highest court froze its $1.6 billion agreement. The head of the Africa Center for Disease Control stood up publicly and said that we want to own our data. So I know it's a lot for us to unpack today, and these are not separate stories, I believe. There is one story here, and it runs through Kinshasa, through Kigali, through Canada, through Iran, and through Washington, D.C., and through every mine in Eastern Congo, where children are working in the dark. So the name at the center of that one story, I believe, is China. And I will do my best to kind of break it down for you all, because this is on Congo Unfiltered, and I'm your host, Gaetan Joe. So let's break it down real quick. So no guest today, it's just me. But before we move into the stories, I want to take a few minutes to kind of like make sure that we all are understanding what's going on, and we also all standing in the same place, looking at the same picture. Because what happened this week or the week before, what happened the past 2 weeks, really cannot be understood without context. And the context stretches back decades. the Congo crisis. For more than 30 years, 3 decades, the Congo, or many said Eastern Congo, a region that the geographic size of Western Europe, holding some of the most strategically significant minerals deposited on the planet. Um, and the Congo has been caught really in a grinding conflict where the world literally depends on those critical minerals. And the world that depends on those critical minerals barely covers the suffering that is happening in the Congo. Western media or mainstream media barely covers them. Because I know you all deeply care, and that's why you haven't stopped showing support to Friends of the Congo, support to the Congolese cause, to the Congolese people, by reposting, by sharing, by documenting. So we are really appreciative for that effort. But it's important to point out that the mainstream media, on the other hand, hasn't been covering the issue of the Congo, hasn't been giving justice to the people of the Congo. Because in that country of almost 100 million people, we have millions of people that have been displaced. We have millions of people that have been killed. And just recently, thousands have died. And the violence has been sustained, I would argue, in large part by competition over the minerals beneath the ground. So, since the late 2021, Rwanda-backed armed groups called M23, the March 23 movement, has been steadily expanding in its control across the North and South Kivu. In January of 2025, last year, the M23 and its Rwandan backers seized the largest city in Eastern Congo, Goma, a city of over a million people, the commercial capital of the East, literally fell in days. Weeks later, we had Bukavu that fell in South Kivu. And then we had Uvira, which was later because it happened during the talks, the conversation happening on December 4th, the signing of the US DRC strategic deal. The US essentially oppressed the M23 to withdraw its force 75 kilometers away from Uvira. So the Congolese armed force, the FRDC, have been fighting back. They have been actually in pain because they kept losing territories after territories. It is almost embarrassing, I have to say. But increasingly, because of the amount of money that has been pouring in, the military complex industry of the Congo, if you can put it that way, the FRDC has been using drones warfare, purchased and developed with new resources, right? So there have been peace negotiations in Doha, Qatar, and backed by the United States, that there have been ceasefire announcements, multiple. And obviously, just like in any war, there have been violations because there is really no incentive, no mechanism in place to enforce those ceasefire, no consequences really. And through all of this, the displacement has unfortunately continued for the Congolese people. And as of today, over 6 million people are internally displaced. Over 6 million people internally displaced in the DRC. One of the largest displacement crises on earth. And that is the military backdrop. Now I want to move to the minerals one, because it's very important that the war is not happening in an area that is empty, in an area that is that doesn't have things that the world needs to power the green energy, power the energy transition, power the automobile industry, power the cell phones, and even things that are needed today to even be able to lead a military campaign. The Eastern Congo, or to just say the Congo, sits on top of a geological fortune, I would say, that the modern world cannot really function without. Cobalt, which goes into every rechargeable battery, iPhone, cell phones, laptops. Coltan and tantalum, which goes into every smartphone and every military communication system, every advanced electronics components uses coltan and tantalum. Copper, which powers the electrical grids and EV motors and batteries of the 21st century. Gold, cassiterite, lithium, I could name them all. It will take us hours. The Democratic Republic of the Congo holds 70% of the world's known cobalt reserves. It is the source of 15 to 30% of the global coltan supply. Unfortunately for the Americans and for the West, Chinese companies and state-linked finances have, over the past 2 decades, built this really dominance across the DRC entire mining value chain. And mostly because of contracts, fair contracts, deal, and sometimes deal, and that has been also documented, deals done with corruption, bribery. The US, under its current forms, cannot openly do that. So they have been losing to China, right? So China has been acquiring assets, locking in offtake agreements, building infrastructure, and according to the World Bank, China controls nearly 50% of DRC's cobalt production. 50%. Just think about that. And more than 70% of the Congo's mining assets overall, owned by China, one country. So Washington, or the United States, has been really slow trying to catch up, trying to control that resources. But Beijing was not. China hasn't. And that asymmetry, that the 2 decades head start, is really the central driver of everything that the United States is now doing in and around the DRC. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about just in Central Africa, in the Congo, or in the Middle East. And it's very important for the rest of the conversation for y'all to understand the connection, all the dots that I'm going to try to connect. And we also have the global health backdrop. Since taking office, the Trump administration has been fundamentally reshaping how the United States delivers global health funding. And we heard about US aid cut, right? That they decided to pause it because some people were against sending aids to foreign nations. Surprisingly, it's okay when that money or more money, or trillions of dollars, billions of dollars, are being sent to other countries deemed allied. But when it comes to sending aid to global south, to African countries, the United States under the Trump administration has been openly, brutally honest about that. And there is one program in particular that caught my attention, is the PEPFAR, which is a program that has kept millions of Africa with HIV alive for 2 decades now. And that program is being restructured under what the administration calls the American First Global Health Strategy. So under this strategy, the US is going country by country, negotiating bilateral health agreements, MOUs, and countries that sign essentially get access to a portion of what they were receiving before, right? And obviously, countries that don't sign lose everything, not a reduction, but everything. And embedded in these agreements, that is what has caused the most, I would say, alarm among public health officials are requirement to share data, because there is really nothing. The United States is not going to provide you with $1 billion of aid just for fun, right? Like it's economy, right? 101. It's like you give me something, I give you something. So it's really about leverage. It's really about what that country can get to the United States in return. So and one of those requirements has been to share data about dangerous pathogens. And think about when, because we literally few years ago we got out of a pandemic, COVID, that started in one country, spread it around, and countries were communicating, sharing knowledge, data. And one of the requirements for that deal, that health deal, is really being able to share those data, so even more than that, but sharing to the United States. And I really want to emphasize, because there is no condition whatsoever that the United States will be sharing whatever data, whatever research, whatever thing that they will have found to either cure or figure out what's going on back to those countries. It is really a one-way system. We give you money in exchange, you will be sharing with us some particular data that are of our interest. So country really must promptly disclose any disease outbreaks to Washington. Again, the agreements do not guarantee that any vaccines or treatments, right, developed by the United States from that shared data will ever come back to the country that provided it. That's very important. So keep these three backdrops in mind: the military conflict, the mineral, and then the health framework, as we're going to move through everything that happened this week. Because I do believe that every single story connects back to all three, right? So to kind of like, since I ended with the health part, I really want to dissect the health components, because that was also very important what happened. And no matter what you heard, it's very important to read the fine print of any deals that is being proposed to people, especially when that deal is not uh, being published, not available to the Congolese people themselves, because after all, it's their data that is going to be shared. So what happened? On Thursday, February 26th, the United States and the DRC signed a 5-year bilateral health agreement, officially called Strategic Health Partnership 2026 to 2031. So the headline number is huge, $1.2 billion, right? So we're talking about $900 million from the United States. And that deal also requires the Congo to invest 300 millions to the DRC itself. So there is a co-investment there, right? But I want y'all to stop and pause for a moment, because we are talking about the fact that the Congo, between 2026, so today, and 2031, the DRC has to invest $300 million into something that is not guaranteed that they will have anything in return in terms of vaccines or whatever discovery that the United States will get from the data that the Congo will share. Because I said at the beginning that the Congo is 100 million people, or at least 100 million people, right? So you can imagine having data from 100 million people, either healthy, sick, or you name them. Another thing to really keep in mind is the fact that the DRC is currently, even though it's not officially said, it's not officially declared by the Congolese parliament, but the DRC is a country that is actively at war in the Congo, because we have part of the country under Rwandan occupation as we speak. So a country whose public health system has been stretched to its absolute limits, battling, you know, mpox, Ebola, malaria, HIV, all at once. A country whose government is spending resources to fight a foreign-backed armed group that is occupying major city in Eastern Congo as we speak. So that country, okay, has been asked to find 300 million of its own money as a condition of receiving the other 900 million dollars, of course. So let me say that again, and perhaps I'm probably going to be even more clear, because I think that it's important that we hold this precisely. It is not a gift, right? It's not foreign aid in a traditional sense, and foreign aid has never been, I would say, an aid. It has always been a leverage for whoever is giving to you. But this is a co-investment framework, right? So the United States is essentially saying, we will give you $900 million, but you have to find $300 million of your own. Sign here and sign now, right? And what we know, what we don't know is very important. What we know is that the deal runs for 5 years, and I say that 2026 to 2031. It was signed under the America First Global Health Strategy. It was negotiated simultaneously with the broader US DRC discussion that also involved the critical mineral access. It is within that context. So the timing here is not a mistake, it's not a coincidence. And these conversations were happening in the same rooms with the same officials in the same weeks. So we don't fully know yet the specific terms, and I really want to be careful with that, right? Because I don't want to be speculating here, and I'm not. So we don't know yet the specific terms around data sharing, pathogen access, and exactly what Congo has agreed to provide in the health and scientific domain, because it's just not public. The Congolese government has not released. So the full MOU text has not been made publicly available. Very important point to mention. And as of this live, so as of today, the Congolese public, the Congolese people, the Congolese parliaments, the Congolese civil society organizations have not been given access to what was signed in the name, just like we've seen with the Washington Accord or the US-DRC Strategic Partnership Deal. And that really matters enormously, I would say, because the head of the African-owned public health body, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, has used explicitly alarming language about exactly these kind of agreements. And that's Dr. Jean Kaseya. And he said that there are a huge concern regarding data, regarding pathogen sharing. We want our own data in Africa. We want to own our future. We cannot accept not owning our data, end of quote. And he said that last week. And I hope that you read carefully his word, because he said that not as an activist, not as a journalist, not as a politician, not as someone running for office, not as someone opposed to the United States at all. He is the Director General of Africa Center of Disease Control, the head of the African Union-owned continental public health body. So he said huge concern. He said we want to own our data, we as Africans. He said that we cannot accept not owning our data. So, and the AP, the Associated Press, in its direct reporting on the DRC deal, literally noted that unclear whether such a requirement is also part of the health partnership between the US and the Congo. And of course, and I'm saying that because that uncertainty is absolutely, is absolutely the story, right? Because the agreement was signed, the terms have not been made fully public. And the continent's top health official has publicly raised alarm about that. So there is a mineral dimension to that and why this cannot really be separated. And this is what I need y'all to kind of like understand the context in which this health deal was signed. Because the same way that Congo signed this agreement, the US DRC negotiation over critical minerals access were actively progressing, right? The United States was pursuing framework to essentially redirect minerals, Congolese copper, cobalt, coltan, away from Chinese controlled supply chains and toward American markets and American companies. And then again, these are not speculation. I'm not speculating here. I'm saying this as a matter of fact because I read the strategic partnership deal, and I tried to guide you in previous episodes to dive deeper into the content of those deals, published at least on the United States party, right? Or side. So the Trump administration has been explicit, and he has himself publicly repeatedly said that this foreign policy is really transactional, and that's really how Trump operates. Very transactional. Resources for access, access for resources, security for minerals, minerals for security. And that is the stated framework. And that is the reason why Tshisekedi's government, the Congolese government, approached the United States in the first place. And the response from the United States was great. We want your minerals. We want your money. We want your lands. We've always wanted your land. We've always wanted your minerals. Now we get to have them for free and freely because you're going to sign an agreement. Let's do it. So when the United States signs a 1.2 billion health deal with the DRC in the same week that is negotiating a strategic minerals partnerships with the DRC, I think we have to ask the question collectively as friends of the Congo, not friends of the Congo as an institution, but friends of the Congo as an idea of wanting to support Congolese people, wanting to be allies of Congolese people, of Black people in Africa, right? Is access to Congo's pathogens and biological data part of the same package as access to Congo's minerals? That question is very interesting, but we don't know for certain. Again, the text has not been released, but I think that we will be naive, and I will say dangerously naive, not to even bother to ask the question. But at least from the Friends of the Congo standpoint as an organization, our position is unambiguous about that. That for us, the Congolese people deserve genuine partnership. They deserve transparency. They deserve to know what the government has signed on their behalf. And they deserve a deal that does not trade their biological sovereignty for 5 years of essentially conditional half funding, right? And and that's why it's very important to be for some organization from the civil society, and it's important for us, or at least for me, to amplify their call to make those MOU public immediately. So now let's talk about other countries, because we don't know what's happening in the Congo in terms of that, because nothing has been published. But we know what other countries' reaction has been regarding that. So let's talk an example of Zimbabwe, and for example, because Congo was saying that something significant was happening next door, right? And here the contrast kind of tells you everything about what is actually at stake in these agreements. Because the truth and the fact is that Zimbabwe walked out of that deal. So on the 25th, so the day before the DRC deal on health was signed, Zimbabwe officially withdrew from negotiation on its proposed bilateral health MOU with the United States. Okay? So the deal on the table for Zimbabwe was worth 367 millions over 5 years. And that is not a small number, honestly, especially when you look at the needs in health that most African countries have, right? If not all. So for a country with Zimbabwe's economic history, and we know Zimbabwe has been under sanctions for years under President Mugabe, that is significant. It's very, very, very significant. Real and also consequential, right? But Zimbabwe, as a sovereign country, looked at the paper, the contract, and the deal, and say no anyways. Why? Why did Zimbabwe's government turn down an over 300 million deal? So I'm going to read to you exactly what the Zimbabwe Secretary for Information, Nick Mangwana, I believe I'm reading his name correctly, said publicly, right? And this is a government official, right? Officially explaining his country's position to the world. And he said, and I quote, Zimbabwe was being asked to share its biological resources and data over an extended period with no corresponding guarantee of access to any medical innovation, such as vaccines, diagnostics of treatments that might result from the shared data. In essence, our nation will provide the raw material for scientific discovery without any assurance that the end products will be accessible to our people should a future health crisis emerge. End of quote. So something that is not saying the quote that I read, because the minister said extended period of time, that period was 25 years. Zimbabwe was signing, or was about to sign, an agreement that will let them get $300 million over 5 years while sharing their data of their people for 25 years. So Zimbabwe here described the deal as clearly lopsided, right? And said it blatantly, that compromises and undermine the sovereignty and the independence of the country, in strong language, deliberate language, I would say, from a government that looked at $367 million, understood what it would mean for their people if that funding disappeared, and still say, no, on these terms, we're not going to do this. We're just going to walk away. And not this way, not without equity, and what we and not without equity, and also in what we can receive in return. The American response was really wow, right? The US Embassy in Zimbabwe issued a statement that says that we will now turn to the difficult and regrettable task of winding down our health assistance in Zimbabwe, end of quote. The US government didn't say pausing. They didn't say they were going to reopen negotiation, trying to bargain and negotiate. They simply said that they were going to end it. And what does that mean in human terms? 1.2 million men and women and children in Zimbabwe are currently receiving HIV treatments through that US supported programs. And 1.2 million people with continued access to medications is now at risk because the government refused to sign an agreement it considered exploitative. So I really want to hold that for a moment because this is what the deal or nothing framework really looks like on the ground. It looks like 1.2 million people who did nothing wrong, who have no say in the geopolitical negotiations here, finding themselves used as leverage, right? That their lives, in effect, are the price of saying no. So other countries also push back. Zambia pushed back. And we also have other countries like Kenya that also push back. And in the Kenya case, it's very interesting because Kenya is the country that signed first, and that was a record $1.6 billion. Kenya signed the largest deal ever recorded so far. And it was held up by American officials as the model, right? A success story, proof that that framework worked, that it is possible to partner with African countries. But the highest court in Kenya has frozen it. And that was the conversation that I was having with Brother Kambale Musavuli, the former spokesperson of Friends of the Congo, when I hosted him, and I had the privilege to host him on this space. He was talking about how African people, the Congolese people, should be able to learn why Kenya's highest court decided to essentially freeze a deal that he considered was violating Kenyan's rights. So the court suspended implementation of the deal because it was legally challenged, right? Kenyan filed, raising 3 or more concerns. I think the first one was that the deal was signed without parliamentary approval, and that should, raise the bell for those who also have been following the Congo story. And second, that deal was signed without any sort of opportunity to review or debate it in terms, like debate, review the terms and debate it at the Kenyan parliament, right? So second, it was also signed without meaningful, I would say, public consultation of the people. Again, the Kenyan people were not informed of what the government was agreeing to on their behalf. And again, that rings the bell to what's going on in the Congo that we have been literally talking about since the signature of the signing of the Washington Accord on June 27, 2025, followed by the US-DRC strategic partnership deal signed on December 4th, 2025, right? Similar thing. We have the response from the Congolese, who the Congolese society filed a petition or a motion to the Supreme Court, and the Congolese Supreme Court had to pause it and said, hey, we need to notify the United States Embassy about this case before moving forward. And by the way, the president, the head of the Supreme Court, is on vacation, so we cannot proceed. And that's the official response that those who filed, and I know it's ridiculous, but that's the reality. The official response that people got, those who filed, that's the response that they get. But in Kenya, the court says, no, pause it. This is illegal. This is unconstitutional. So, and then third, that it contains clauses requiring the transfer of biological specimens and health data to US entities with absolutely no framework requiring benefit sharing. Just like I've read to you the quotes from the Zimbabwean minister, and no guarantee at all here that Kenya would ever receive access to any vaccines or treatment developed using its own people biological information, right? So the court has not yet ruled on the merits. So this is not a final judgment, but the fact that the Kenya court found sufficient, I would say, legal, cause to freeze the deal, I think to say, in effect, stop, we need to look at this before it goes any further and ask a question if this is in itself a profound legal and political statement. And I think it is, right? And the bridge here to the DRC and why that matters for Kinshasa is because that deal was signed on the 26th of February, 2 days after Kenya's court moved to freeze Kenya's deal. The DRC parliament did not even have a chance to review the agreement before it was signed. Same thing. The Congolese public, the people, has not even seen the full terms of it, right? So if Kenyan owns court are saying, wait, the DRC government, right? The DRC government has every right and every responsibility to ask the same question, because the Kenyan government or the Kenyan highest court said, wait, what about Congolese people? What about Congolese government? What about Congolese highest court? So I think it is very, very important, because before we go into praising, and I've seen that on social media, on X, praising this health deal and about what it's going to bring, I think it is important for us, at least for the sake of transparency, to ask for the release of those texts, the full text, the full MOU, not a summary, not an English version, a version that will be released in French and in all 4 national languages of the Congo. Because the people of the Congo have the rights to know what is signed in the names, right? So I think that is a really good segue, because again, I said that these were signed in the middle of the negotiation with the US DRC partnerships, and how the Trump administration really wanted to impose peace, and I'm literally using the terms, because they wanted to focus on the supply chain. They wanted to be able to secure minerals, and it was important, critical for the war to stop, the war in the Congo to stop, the war that Rwanda has been raging on the Congolese people to stop, whether they are using M23 today, CNDP, RCD, AFDL, or all those armed groups need to stop. So, and I think during the same week that it was announced, I think it was February 24th, if I'm not mistaken, around between 3 and 6, it was already in the morning when I got the news that a drone officially attributed to the Congolese Armed Force Group, the FRDC, in the context of a war, struck near the coltan mining hub of Rubaya in North Kivu province. Rubaya is one of the largest coltan hub, I would say, right? Largest coltan mine in the world. And that mine is currently controlled by the M23. Before the M23, it was controlled by a man who was, I would say, former member of parliament, because he has been arrested and sentenced to death. I don't think that he was executed yet. Mogashushu, who was a member of parliament, and that member of parliament used to be part of the CNDP, another armed group supported by Rwanda. So he was giving that mine, and after he was arrested, shortly after the reappearance of the M23, Tshisekedi arrested him. Obviously, his administration arrested him and gave that mine to his brother. Felix Tshisekedi gave the mine to his brother, Christian Tshisekedi, I believe. So it's very important for us to understand that, to see how really it has always been about mines. It has always been about minerals. So that strike, that drone strike, is very significant because of the location it happened, but also because of who was killed. Because the strike kills the Colonel Willy Ngoma, the M23 military spokesperson, I think along with at least 9 other people. And then Reuters said that the body was really not, like, you could not recognize the body. They were so burned that you could not even tell who the other people were, right? And the report was also suggesting that Sultani Makenga, M23 military commander, was able to escape. So, but who was Willy Ngoma? It's really interesting because I want to spend a moment on who Ngoma was, because the easy narrative is to describe him as a spokesperson and just move on, right? As much more than that he is the military spokesperson. He's the face, because that's PR, of the M23, besides Kone Nanga. Ngoma was in the Congolese army. He survived in the M23 first defeat. And he endured essentially years of exile in Uganda, and then came back in 2021. So over those years, he became not just the face of the M23, but one of its most operationally significant figures, I think, because he appeared at press conferences, he escorted capture fighters for the cameras, and you remember the folks coming from Romania and those Eastern European, and saying quickly, like making fun of them and stuff. So that's him, right? Because he was able to also show that the Tshisekedi's regime was actively using mercenaries, which is illegal under an international law. So I really want to be able to say that, because I don't want people to think that I only criticize the Tshisekedi's regime, or that I don't never criticize the Tshisekedi regimes. This episode is about calling out everyone who is somehow violating international law, killing civilians, and exacerbating the crisis that we've seen unfold, right? So he essentially, back to Willy Ngoma, he articulated M23's position to the international press. So when Ngoma fell in January 2025, Ngoma was one of the first rebel officers to appear at the airport, right? And as a matter of fact, when I think I just saw today, and it was actually interesting, that he's under, or was, because he's now dead, under US sanctions. And the footnote, you can read that he has dual citizenship, but they start by saying that he's of Rwandan citizenship. And that's not me saying that, that's the US Department of Treasury. And alternative citizenship Congolese citizenship. So I think it's also worth mentioning that besides being sanctioned by the US, he's also sanctioned by the EU in December 2022, right? So he was sanctioned by the EU in 2022, then sanctioned by the United States in December 2023, specifically for atrocities committed in Kishishe, where we had over 100 folks, Congolese people, civilians killed. Entire villages massacred, right? And that was in November 2022, where the M23 fighters, terrorists, rebels, whatever words you want to use to describe them, right, were credibly implicated in mass killings and sexual violence against civilians, right? And so the EU, the United States, and the EU, and the UN, the United Nations, all three sanctioned the man. So I think that level of convergence is interesting because it shows the level of which the man is should be held accountable, right? So justice wasn't that for him to die. That's too easy, I think. Justice would have wanted him to be standing in trial for war crimes and crimes for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But that's just me. That's just me giving my opinion. But what these strikes really means in terms of military and diplomatically, because military, this is one of the most significant single blows that the M23 commands structure since the movement's resurgence. Because, as I mentioned, Ngoma wasn't merely a communications officer. He wasn't just somebody standing in front of the camera and speaking. He was a strategist, a symbol, and a bridge between the M23 military operation and the outside world. So I think that his death degrades M23 operational communications. It will be really interesting to see in what way, in what capacity they are going to be able to adjust and fully assess what's going to happen next, right? Because I also mentioned that the location was important, that the strike happened near Rubaya, one of the world's most important sources of coltan, producing an estimated 15 to 30% of the global supply, right? And this is not incidental. And I think if you have to really think about it, the Congolese government decision to conduct a targeted operation near one of the most strategically significant mining sites in the world at the moment when the US DRC minerals negotiation are happening and you have a ceasefire in place. And this really sends multiple messages to the M23, I believe, first and foremost to Rwanda, and probably to China. I'm going to argue that because diplomatically, the strike put the already fragile Doha ceasefire framework under severe pressure because you say ceasefire and now you kill our spokesperson. We are literally negotiating and you're killing our spokesperson. So both sides, by the way, right? And I'm not trying to be one-sided here, even though I'm pro-Congo, so I will side for the Congo, right? But I need to say that both sides have accused each other. Tshisekedi, the Congolese government, the illegitimate Congolese government, has accused the M23 and Rwanda of violating the ceasefire multiple times. The M23 also has accused multiple times the Congolese government of violating that ceasefire. As a matter of fact, the M23 described the strike as a betrayal of the ceasefire process, right? So I want to be really careful here because I think it's very important to not lose sight of something that the FRDC targeted within Goma. That kill is the military headlines that is being talked about. And that's why I'm talking about. But the strike also killed at least 9 other people, possibly more, right? We do not have full information on who those individuals were. And I said the body was so burned that we could not recognize them. So what's the roles? Are they civilians? Are they combatant? Right? And the M23 is supposed to tell us that because they are occupying that place. And that's the thing that I found really interesting. When you said that you want to free a country, but you cannot provide death toll in the war, civilian casualties, that you in the same Rubaya mine, and that was last week or early this week, you have 200 people who died again in that mine. 70 of them were children. So you also have M23 that continues to repeat the things that they have been accusing the Congolese governments of doing. Can't keep track of who is dying and who is alive, who needs help, who needs. They're not governing those regions. It's more like they are just interesting to one thing, the minerals. Hence why at Congolese Action Youth platforms, we are calling this a genocide, genocide for economic gain. Because this war was never about one tribe. It was never about the citizenship of one people. It is about securing minerals, right? So any targeted military operation has a human cost that really extends beyond the intended target. So the Congolese government has framed this as a decisive military victory. I think that was probably exaggerated a little bit because Goma is still under control. Bukavu is still under occupation. On the other hand, the M23 is framed that as an atrocity. But the truth is that, as so often the case in the Congo, it is complicated and maybe not be fully known for some times. And that reminds me of this really interesting quotes that my dad used to tell me that if somebody explained to you the politics of the Congo and you understand, it means that you haven't been taught or explained correctly. It's so complicated, so complex. But what is not complicated here is that people have died. That's a fact. That the ceasefire is on a strain. That Felix Tshisekedi has created a situation internally that seems to be given reason, whether it is legitimate or not, for people to take weapons. And those people, when they take weapons, or when they condone the violence, what we see, just like we see in any war, is the death of innocent people, the death of women and children, the death of people who have been living through 3 decades of conflicts, through displacements, through violence, through the theft of the lands and the resources. And those people continue to bear the weight of a war. Can you imagine people, you have 1, 2, 3 generation of folks born, die, getting married in war. So in that context, because you want to bring peace, and that's the framework that is presented to us by the Trump administration, they want to be able to bring peace. Actually, they're arguing that they brought peace in the Congo. So we saw after the drone strike, after the health deal, after Zimbabwe walked out, after the Kenyan situation with the court freezing the deal, that the United States, in a unique move, unprecedented move, sanctioned Rwanda's military. On Monday, March 2nd, 2026, the United States Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, imposed sanctions on the Rwanda Defense Force. And not just the Rwanda Defense Force, but also 4 of its most senior commanding officers. The 4 individuals named are Major Vincent Nyakarundi, which is the RDF Army Chief of Staff, the Major General Ruki Karusisi, commander of the 5th Infantry Division, and the General Mubarak Muganga, the Chief of Defense Staff, and finally Brigadier General Stanislas Gashugi, the Special Operation Force Commander. These are not random figures, and actually for the very first one, Vincent Nyakarundi, he is allegedly the biological father of the former president of Mahoro Peace Association, which is a nonprofit based, they're actually based anywhere, like Banyamulenge nonprofits, a nonprofit that says that they are literally born in the aftermath of the Gatumba massacre, which is in Burundi, I believe, and born after that massacre, and they created Mahoro Peace Association. And that association, that nonprofit, is based in the United States. And I think on paper, they're based in the state of Texas. And the former president, daughter, Adele Kibasumba, along with the nonprofits, were named and accused by United Nations of providing at least $1 million between 2019 and 2021 to the M23. We're talking about a period when the M23 was dormant. The M23 was no longer receiving direct support from Rwanda because of the sanction that had happened in 2012 under President Obama, who implemented Public Law 109-456, Section 105, and decided to withhold aid to Rwanda because Rwanda was destabilizing the Congo. And after that withhold of aid, we saw other countries, we saw other institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, follow suit. So then Rwanda, in that perspective, in that regard, was stuck, but it needed to still survive the Twirwaneho, the M23, and now we have the AFC. And that's why they were able to find this, I would say, brilliant scheme, because they're, again, going around, finding loopholes around the IRS, disguising themselves as a nonprofit, forcing their members, to donate, to contribute monthly, $40, $50, and you have 40,000, at least 40,000 members, not just in Texas, they're also in New Jersey, they're also in Portland, Maine. They are everywhere. You can find a big or structured Banyamulenge organization. I'm not saying that they're all guilty, because I mentioned that some of them are forced to contribute. And the United Nations report that I really invite everyone to go and read, and I'm probably going to have to find that, post that for the exact report where they are mentioned, for you all to be understanding what I am actually talking about. Let me see. I'm trying to see the reports. I will get back to it to find the actual report that talks about that. Yes, I found it. The report is S/2023/431. And that reports essentially explain how Maho Peace Association is operating or has been operating. So Vincent Nyakarundi, beside or beyond being just the RDF Army Chief of Staff, his daughter led that organization for what, 3, 4 years, 5 years, funding the M23. But him along his 3 comrades are men who run the Rwanda's military at its highest institution level. And as of March 2nd, the US held assets, if they have any, and I think they probably do, who doesn't use dollars, especially in Africa, right? They probably have banks. He showed up to Washington, D.C. recently, last year at least. So the US held assets are now frozen, or should be frozen by at least April 1st. So American entities are prohibited from transacting with them, right? What does it mean? It means that any financial institution anywhere that engages in significant transactions with the RDF now risks exposure to the US. They cannot be doing, deals with them. They cannot be using the dollars. That's the whole point of also being sanctioned. And that itself is a banking system level consequence. But I really wouldn't bank on that. I wouldn't really be naive and think and say that these sanctions are okay. But that's probably something that I'm going to expand later. Because here's what the US Treasury said officially on the records as they were publishing this, as they were announcing the sanction. They said, and I quote, the M23's offensive will not have been possible without the active support and complicity of the RDF and key senior officials, end of quote. So Treasurer here also confirmed that thousands of RDF's troops are deployed across Eastern DRC. This is something that we have been saying since the beginning of this war. Go back to our tweets. Go back to our previous episodes talking about that in January of last year, February, March. Read things that Michaela Wrong wrote on the NBC, on The Guardian, and other scholars and journalists have been writing about this specific issue. We have been saying that the Rwanda Defense Force, and now we have been saying that, but also the United States is also saying that for the first time, I will say in a sanction, that the RDF is actively engaging in combat operation. That the RDF, the Rwandan Defense Force, has introduced advanced military equipment to the battlefield. And we're talking about GPS jamming system, air defense equipment, drones, and in a threads last year, I essentially broke down where the M23 was getting its weapon from. Yes, from Rwanda, but who is selling to Rwanda? And I mentioned Poland, who is part of NATO. I mentioned Turkey. I mentioned Chinese drone bot. I also mentioned Israeli weapons bot that the M23 possess. Weapons that the former secretary of the UN mission in the Congo said that the M23 had weapons that were far above, that surpassed the capacity of the weapons of the UN. Can you imagine that? But it makes sense when you see that NATO and Israel have been equipping Rwanda, which itself equips the M23. And that is essentially that the RDF is providing that support in exchange for providing, I would say, those equipments, those military equipments in exchange for a military support to M23 because they want to support the M23, that Rwanda has, in that regard, gained access because of that support, gained access to the mineral-rich areas. And you remember, still talking about the Rubaya coltan mine, few months before President Biden's end of term, the Biden administration, when they were talking about the Lobito corridor, which is a railroad that will go from the Katanga province all the way to the west to Angola port, the Lobito port, to be exporting or to export those minerals directly to the United States. They proposed in the name of peace and also to kind of like appease, to calm down Kagame and said, hey, we have opportunity here to both make money. Both countries can make money on this. What about we extend that railroads to the Rubaya mine, which is in Congolese, which is the Congolese territory. It is in the Congo. But they ask Paul Kagame that question. And Kagame says no. So that also talks about the main thesis of today's episode is really who controls the minerals of the Congo. Not the Congolese, and I can tell you that. Because when you have to ask a foreign leader whether or not he's okay for them to build the railroads in a region that is still in the Congo, that probably tells you the official position of the United States. But that official position was changed when that sanction happened, because on records, the United States now is saying that the RDF, the Rwandan military, has been extracting Congolese minerals through its proxies armed groups, through the M23. That is not an NGO report. And I know folks from Rwanda, pro Kagame, and I salute, by the way, one of the most noble Rwandan citizens that I know, Claude Gatebuke, because he will always tell me that they are liars. They will always come up with lies. So when you come with the reports showing the truth, they will try to say that this is fake news and this is wrong. And you see that as a talking points now from the Rwandan governments, that Amnesty International is lying, Human Rights Watch is lying, Global Witness is lying, when they're all accusing Rwanda of using proxy groups or armed groups to not just destabilize the Congo, but also extracting minerals, turning them into Rwandan minerals and selling them overseas, whether it's in the Middle East, UAE, or to the United States and the European Union. But this is not an NGO report, and this is not a UN expert panel, because they're also trying to say that what the UN has been saying against Rwanda is also not true. That's the US Department of Treasury talking, an executive branch of the US government. So Rwandan government spokesperson Yolande Makolo, who is ironically of Congolese origin, called the sanction unjust, talking about justice after 30 years of killing people. She said that they misrepresent the reality of the conflict, that Rwanda's position has not changed, that they have never acknowledged the role, and that Rwandan force remain in Congo today. And I think that's very important. It's important because I asked the question of who really control Congolese minerals. Who controls the Congo? Who decides on the Congo? And when we have the third points, when we have, I don't even know how to even frame it, because when I found out about that appointment, that nomination last year in February, I was among the folks that talked about that appointment, that the M23 after Goma fell after they seized Goma, after Rwanda occupied Goma, that they appointed people to govern Goma. They appointed a governor, but they also appointed a vice governor. And one of them is a man that is, as of today, a Canadian citizen, which I understand the dual citizenship, and I am not against that. But here's the reality, and here's what really bothering me in this story. That the M23, a group that is considering itself as a Congolese group, the armed opposition, that's how they call themselves, has installed a man named Willy Manzi as the vice governor of North Kivu. He is the civilian face of the M23's administrative project in the east, in Goma, in North Kivu. He gives press conference and sometimes in Kinyarwanda, and I'm not going to dive into whether or not Kinyarwanda is a Congolese language. I mean, it's as foolish as saying the French, because we do have French people who are American, that French is an American language. Though the US doesn't have an official language. So let me try that again. It's like saying that Lingala, because we do have French folks, Congolese people living in France today who speak Lingala, who speak Swahili. It's like saying that Swahili is a French language. Absurd, right? But anyway, he talks about reconstructing Goma or the Congo. He talks about reconciliation. So he's the M23's political cover, I would say, dressed in a language of governance and diplomacy. And now he has been confirmed, because we talked about this last year, February of 2025. I remember Ponce writing about that in French. I remember writing about this in English. I remember other folks on X that have been really following issues that I salute, Son of Congo, Curtis, writing about it, tweeting about it. I remember MC Lionel tweeting about it. But here's the truth now that we now know, because we have evidence. Willy Manzi, Williams Manzi Garambe, okay? He's a Canadian citizen. He was resettled in Canada through a UNHCR refugee resettlement program. And he built his life there. Like I mentioned in the beginning, he married people. He married someone, a Canadian citizen, has Canadian children. Beautiful. The Canadian dream, if I could say. And Canada took him in when he needed sanctuary, because he presented himself to the Canadian authority as a Rwandan citizen running away from persecution. And that was his absolute right. That was his right to flee persecution. That was his right. But then he presented documents because he was trying to get refugee status, rightfully so, because no person can be persecuted for their political opinion, their tribes, their ethnicity, their race. But he presented himself as a Rwandan citizen. And I think his case became interesting because we saw that the Canadian courts ended up giving him that Canadian citizenship. Because there was something very interesting in his case, because he was Rwandan citizen himself, that his mom is of Rwandan citizenship, his dad is from Uganda, or maybe I'm mixing the two, and he first fled to Uganda. So the problem here was that, can someone who could have seek refuge in the neighborhood countries, can that person still be allowed to seek refuge in Canada? That became jurisprudence. Jurisprudence, not sure how to say that in English. It was a case that forced the Canadian immigration system to reassess or revalue how they were treating refugee status case by case. Because at the end of the day, people do have the right to choose where they really want to flee to, right? Like, you cannot be forced to become a Ugandan citizen if you still don't think that you're going to be safe in Uganda, which is right next door. But the problem here that I really want to point is that he returned to Africa finally, not to rebuild a peaceful Congo, not to uh, serve the Congolese people, but to serve as the political and administrative face of an armed groups backed by foreign military and responsible for mass atrocities. And something that I still going to say allegedly, right? He's allegedly the nephew of Bosco Ntaganda, convicted by the International Criminal Courts on 18 counts of war crimes, crimes against humanity, murder, rape, sexual slavery, and obviously the conscription of use of child soldiers. He was sentenced to 30 years. And I'm not sure, I'm not saying here that because he's the nephew of Bosco Ntaganda that he's bearing the responsibility of his uncle. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that to just remind people that Bosco Ntaganda himself presented himself as a Rwandan citizen at the very beginning of his trial. And he stated that in his ICC trial, and he explicitly said that he was Rwandan born in Kinigi, Rwanda, not Congolese. So his nephew, alleged nephew, now governs the North Kivu under the M23 administration, which I found really absurd when I'm like, so you all are saying that you are a Congolese group and you want to free the Congo. And to kind of paraphrase my brother Ponce Nyambo, and he said, Nyembo, and he said that the first opportunity that you have to appoint men and women to lead that country that you said that you liberated, you bring somebody who most likely never put his feet in Goma, who's never Congolese. And even if he was Congolese and he just lied, the question that I ask, why lying? In that time, 2005, 2002, whatever the time they arrived in Canada, the Congo wasn't in peace. The Congo was in conflict. Literally. Why lie? And why having somebody with absolutely no ethics to lie to get papers, commit perjury, have that person essentially lead one of the largest province in Eastern Congo. So I think the Congolese community did a really good job to denounce what was happening, because nobody knew that the effect that those calls and letters and petition was going to bring, like the fruits of those denunciation. And that's the beauty or the strength or the power of speaking up. because the Congolese communities in Canada, in Ottawa, in Gatineau, were saying no. It doesn't make sense for a Canadian citizen to organize, take weapons, and be responsible of killing and massacring people. That the Canadian government should be able to take action. What it means for a Canadian citizen to serve in an administrative and political capacity for an armed group responsible for documented atrocities. I think that was the whole point. That's the core. And that's the same thing that I've been asking Congolese people here in the US, talking about Mahoro Peace and all these people who call themselves Congolese, yet are supporting Twirwaneho. They are taking weapons and killing United Nations peacekeepers, which is a war crimes. Targeting civilians at airport, killing women, raping them, slaughtering entire villages, as we saw, as we read, documented for the Kishishi massacre. What does it mean to be a US citizen, to be a Canadian citizen, to be an American, and still somehow involved in armed groups creating chaos overseas? What does it mean to be part of a nonprofit based in the US with all the rules that the IRS has, avoiding to pay taxes so that they can collect at least $1 million and funnel all of that money overseas? What does it mean? That the Canada government, the US government they both have a responsibility here. That the government of Canada should open a formal investigation to review whether Mr. Willy Manzi activity constitutes grounds for citizenship revocation. It's simple. Whether the former president of the Mahoro Peace Association and all the members who were actually part of the Rwanda apparatus system, security system, former rebels, people who work closely with Kagame, to be able to take over a nonprofit, collect the money in the name of fighting genocide that happened in Gatumba, far away from, not even in the Congo. The Gatumba massacre did not happen in the Congo, by the way. So you're going to hijack a noble cause, collect money, raise funds to create more killings. That the United States, just like the Canada government, has responsibility there too, to revoke citizenship to citizens, whether they are Rwandan American or Congolese American, to revoke their citizenship. Because I believe that when I was discussing with my brother, son of Congo, he was telling me that when you become a US citizen, they ask you if you were ever enrolled, like if you ever took part of an armed group. So it's impossible for you to get naturalized while being actively in a rebellion overseas to be part of an armed groups. So whether it's the United States, Canada, or even the United Kingdom, Belgium, France, the entire Western governments to conduct similar reviews, because it is very important. It is important for them to not just review, but also provide sanctions. Not sanction in terms of sanctioning people, but like literally, like it's illegal to materially participate in conflicts overseas, to take weapons and destabilize the country overseas. that level of impunity must end, because having a Western passport shall not give you the right to plunder and kill in other countries. So I want really to pull, and I know this has been a really on the long side, because I thought that it was very important for us to like combine everything. Because I really want to pull all of this together, and I want to do it through a framework that I've seen circulating online, still in the context of geopolitical circle or geopolitical stories or narrative, that I think is right as far as it goes, but I would also say critically incomplete, right? Incomplete in a way that matters tremendously for the Congo. And I tweeted about it. I wrote an article, still trying to reiterate the same idea, trying to not just unpack what geopolitical analyst Chris Cappy said, but also trying to argue more, because he argued that the United States is executing a coherent, grand strategy designed to weaken China. The US is trying to weaken China because we see the competition and it's obvious. And if you have been ignoring the reality, that is the reality. That we all thought that it was Russia, but it's not Russia, it's China. Because Russia is struggling right now in Ukraine. But we're also seeing how China is rising economically and also on the world stage. So that grand strategy is designed to weaken China's global position before, I would say, any confrontation in what looks to be the next stage, Taiwan. So his framework, and I really encourage y'all to look him up and give him a follow if you really want to understand the geopolitics happening, that his framework kind of like identifies three pillars. The pillars one is Iran and Venezuela, that the US must, and I've said the US, right? The US empire must destabilize both to cut roughly 20% of China's oil supply, and that's his argument. And the Operation Epic Fury that we saw, or that we are seeing day 7, that the war that we are watching like it is a soccer game and almost disgusting. It's like, oh, how many missiles flew in this country and how many missiles landed there. Watching war now like it's a video game. But that is pillar one. The pillar two is Mexico, and I had really hard time understanding that one. But his thesis there is that the U.S. must dismantle cartel infrastructure to essentially secure the U.S.-Mexico trade corridors, to essentially fortify the North American production base. And another thing that some of the talking points that I think I've heard from the right wing or the Republican, they're saying that the drugs is also being encouraged or pushed through by China. I haven't had a chance or the time to look into that claim, but I think it's important for the sake of the conversation to state that. And pillar three, and I mentioned Russia already, the pillar three is Russia and NATO, that the US needs to neutralize the Russian threats to Europe. And that was the whole point of why NATO was created in the first place. That will essentially, once you neutralize Russia, and that's why Russia is really battling right now in Ukraine, but in reality is the whole NATO, that will free Washington's strategic bandwidth. And we've seen Trump's administration more and more not wanting to invest that much in NATO because they want to be able to refocus their resources elsewhere. hence Israel. But the argument here is that all three really prepare the United States to confront or deter China over Taiwan without being pulled into sort of like multi directions, right? Many directions. But I think honestly that the logic is coherent, and I've said that in the article. But I also think that it is missing a fourth pillar. And if you're asking you how is Congo relevant, and that is the case, that fourth pillar, according to me and according to what I've seen and read so far in terms of all the documents published with the different uh, 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 reports or deals, that pillar runs directly through Kinshasa or to the Congo. And that pillar 4 here is the DRC and critical minerals. Because the US needs to systematically displace China from the physical supply chain of copper, cobalt, and coltan. And I said, explaining what all these minerals are, how important those minerals were, and the place that the Congo has in being a deposit of those minerals. That fourth pillar really gives the US preferential access, and that's the term that you read in the Washington Accord, the US DRC Strategic Partnership Agreement. That accord or that agreement also redirect the Lobito corridor from the Chinese linked export routes to American markets, because they wanted to replicate, and that's something that I've had in my conversation with Brother Kambale, that the US really wanted to replicate the Chinese model in terms of building roads, the Silk roads, and building that same exact roads that will be exporting minerals directly to the US. And that accord, the US-DRC strategic partnership, also established a strategic asset reserve, SAR, that gives US entities the right of first offer on Congo's most strategic mining asset. And here's the really the architectural, I would say, details of almost that no one is talking about, because the US partnership agreements really builds a China exclusion mechanism. And that mechanism directly is embedded into the legal framework. And I was actually this morning reading about what one of the law that the US has in place to do that, because the agreement really defines categories called aligned person, right? That entity is really that qualifies, that the entities that qualify for preferential access under the deal. So if you are aligned persons, it means that you are not tied to covenation. And if you go to 10 USC section 4872, it names or it defines what covenation is. And on point 2, it says that the term covenation means the Democratic Republic of North Korea, right? The Islamic Republic of Iran, the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China. So Chinese here entities are therefore structurally ineligible, because we all know that Russia is already at war. Iran is being targeted right now. Now it's like China. Maybe we're not gonna bother North Korea because that leader is that leader. So let him be, you know. So, and here the oil leverage here is very important. That the trade corridor here matters. That NATO stability matters to counter Russia. But really, none of those run on fossil fuels alone, right? Think about that. They run on copper, on cobalt, on coltan. those ships, those planes, those drones, cell phones, and other electronics. And most of that really right now comes, as I've demonstrated, from the DRC, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So Washington, D.C. and the US understand that. And yes, I've said that they have been late in the game, but they understand that, and now they are moving to really lock in that supply chain. So the question that must define our, I would say, advocacy, or even your interest in the Congo, is whether the Congolese people will be allowed to ever determine the terms of the own country's role in that equation. I think that's very fundamental. The other question also is whether the DRC will once again be the terrain or the geopolitical battlefield of a great power competition from which Congolese citizens unfortunately receive nothing but the consequences. So I'm going to leave you guys to this, because I know it was a lot to talk. It's almost 2 hours. But when you see things happening in Iran, in Russia, always ask yourself, what's the end goal? When you see contract being signed and the US is pushing for it, ask yourself, what's the content of those deals? Why those deals are not even being published by Congolese people or Congolese officials in the first place? When the sanctions are targeting a country that has been strategically one of the closest ally of the US in Central Africa, you have to ask yourself, why now? So there is a temptation here, at least in the media coverage and in policy circles, to really treat the Congo as series of crisis, right? Because I had a question that one time I was discussing geopolitics with a student, and he was essentially saying that, oh, I watched that movie, the documentary Crisis in the Congo, Uncovering the Truth. Look it up, look up that documentary online on YouTube. And he said, but that documentary is old. It's from 2013. Why you guys haven't made another one? Wow. First thing that came to mind was like, one, budget. But two, if you think about that, it is the same thing. It's the same principle. The only thing that changes is just the names. The roles are the same. You still want to have a president of the Congo who represent the Congolese elites that is corrupt. You're still going to have a regional actors for Kagame that has been there for over 20 years, and Museveni. You're still going to have multinational organizations or corporations that are plundering the Congo and exacerbating the war because it's profiting them. You're still going to have the supply chain continue to flow to Western countries. So you have 4 dimensions of the crisis in the Congo. We do not need another documentary. But when you look at the health crisis, the conflict, the mineral crisis, the humanitarian emergency, each one of them seems to be reported separately, right? And each one seems to be treated as one story that seems really disconnected from the others. But the Congo here, the DRC, is not a series of crises. The Congo is a country with over 100 million people, a country with extraordinary wealth, extraordinary culture, extraordinary resilience, a country that has been subjected, unfortunately, to extraction. Think about December 4th, 1885. President Groover was the very first Western president to formally recognize Congo Free State, and Leopold II as the leader of the Congo Free State, the very first one, not Belgium, not France, not the United Kingdom, the United States. So on December 4th, 1885, on his very first State of Union address, he's going to reiterate that support. What happened 140 years later? December 4th, 2025, and if you've been following Congo Unfiltered and Friends of the Congo for months, what happened? The Congolese elites signed an agreement with the same United States to essentially hand over the resources. So the minerals, the biological resources, whether it's pathogens or data, the sovereignty, the human dignity, all of that has been subjected to extraction for over a century, 140 years. And a country that has been told in different eras and different languages that the terms of that extraction are not his to set. It is not up to the Congolese people, unfortunately, to set the terms. That is exactly what we've seen, I would say, the past few weeks with the health deal, with the sanctions, with the Rwandan Canadian vice governor of the Congo's North Kivu, with the war in Iran and how it also trickled down to the supply chain with resources, the drone strike that killed the M23 spokesperson. All of that is just part of one story. The story that brings us back to the fundamental question: who controls the Congo? I'm going to expand it to another fundamental question: who benefits from its resources? Who decides its future? And something that our executive director, Maurice Carney, always tells me: when you hear the word critical resources, strategic partnership, it's critical to whom? It is strategic to whom? Because the Congolese people here should be able to decide their future. That has been the quest and the mission and the journey his whole life until he died of Patrice Lumumba. In a Pan-African spirit, that has been the fight of so many people in Africa, as well as folks from the outside, allies that supported the Congolese people. Go read what Malcolm X has said about the Congo. Go read MLK, Dr. Martin Luther King position on the Congo. Go read about George Washington Williams, his position on the Congo. And that is what Friends of the Congo believes. And that is what exactly Friends of the Congo is for as an organization. And this is exactly what this show is for. Not for you to watch, not for you to just repost, not for you to just narrate, but for you to be able to be informed, to be organized, to be sustained in this advocacy that we do believe can change the equation. An equation right now that seems to fixate the Congo as a battlefield, but we say that the Congo is a country. Because we refuse the reality that Congo should remain collateral damage. The people of the Congo should be collateral damage. Just to paraphrase the current president of the Congo when he went and pay tributes in Rwanda a few years ago to the 5.6 millions of Congolese people who perished as a result of the war, as per the International Rescue Committee, are collateral damage. We said no, they're not collateral damage. There are people that deserve justice, and that must be the center of our mission, the center of this story, the center of our struggle. And in the same spirit of that struggle and being able to give our version of the truth or tell our story, to lead actions. That's why we have brilliant Congolese men and women, and I'm talking about Maman Justine, that is coming back to the United States to share her story to Congress men and women, the people in America that you all elected, so that justice goes back in the solution to the crisis in the Congo, not sanctions that are subjective and abused, not overseeing Americans' own law, not disregarding the international law, but to realize that Congolese people have rights as people and they deserve justice. And that's why if you haven't received our email, join our email list. Follow us on our social media. Congo Friends on TikTok, Instagram, on X. Follow us, subscribe on YouTube to be informed, be involved, stay informed, and take action. I hope to be back next Saturday by God's grace, and until then, I'm asking you to take care of yourself, practice self-care, and for those who are relentlessly speaking out, keep speaking up, keep writing, keep denouncing, keep pressuring your government, and keep exposing the truth, the 4 dimensions that are causing chaos in the Congo. So this was Gaetan. I appreciate y'all for being tuned in, and I will catch you guys next week. Have a great weekend. Ciao.